Hello everybody, my name is Kara, and today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite writers of all time. I talk pretty frequently about how much I love and admire Oscar Wilde's works, so as part of the Irish Readathon, which I am currently participating in, I decided to do an entire video focusing on his plays. Now, I did recently read and enjoy The Picture of Dorian Gray, and even though I did like it, I'm going to focus primarily on his plays because I feel like, for the most part, those don't get quite as much focus. So, Oscar Wilde was an Irish playwright, author, and poet, and he wrote during the 19th century. Like I said, he was Irish, but he did spend a lot of his life in England, and that's where his plays were primarily performed or where they opened for the first time. Now, besides being famous for his novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, he is also, unfortunately, very well known for the tragic manner in which he died. In 1895, he was arrested for sodomy because at the time it was still illegal to be gay in England, and he was sentenced to hard labor in prison, and he actually was later sentenced to be executed. He was released, however, but his health never recovered. 5 years after he was arrested, he died of a disease that was then known as cerebral meningitis. He died when he was only in his 40s, and I do think it's important to talk about some of his background and some of the things that happened during his life and what led to his death, because he was such a fantastic writer, and I'm not saying that I think we should focus completely on his tragic end to his life, but I do think that's an important thing to acknowledge and talk about while we're discussing some of his fantastic works. So far, the plays that I have read of his are Lady Windermere's Fan, A Woman of No Importance, The Importance of Being Earnest, and Salome. So one of the reasons I think Oscar Wilde is such a great playwright, and especially a great kind of starter playwright, is that he's really, really funny. You've probably heard some of his famous quotations. I mean, seriously, if you read one of his works, play or novel, pretty much within the first chapter, you'll run across at least 6 or 7 different quotations that you've heard on coffee mugs or from public speakers or just any aspect of life. Pretty much you'll hear some Oscar Wilde at some point. So you probably have heard about Oscar Wilde's immense talent for humor, but one of the things that I feel like doesn't get talked about quite as much is the incredible way that he crafts complex characters. I think part of this is due to the fact that The Importance of Being Earnest is, I think, his most well-known play, and it's great, don't get me wrong. But that one, I feel like, in comparison to a couple of others that I mentioned, I think it's not quite as in-depth as far as the characterization goes, which is of course totally fine. It's still a valid work of art. But I do think that Oscar Wilde has a sometimes underappreciated talent for observing and discussing human nature, the good and the bad. He especially shines with his characterizations of women. Some of his female characters are just so brilliantly developed, and they have so much depth and heart, and especially when you're reading a play, you know, all you're getting is dialogue. So to be able to draw that detailed picture of a person with just words spoken to or from them is pretty incredible. I'm especially thinking of a couple of female characters from Lady Windermere's Fan, which is coincidentally my favorite play of his that I have read so far. But there are a couple of women from that play in particular who I think are just so complicated, and they shine. They're brilliant characterizations, and some of my favorite characters from plays or probably any medium, and they're just a joy to read because, especially during that time period, women were not often portrayed as being fully realized people and characters. So going along with his skill at characterization, there's a point when I start any Oscar Wilde play, and sometimes this occurs with other playwrights too, where the cast of characters is so overwhelming, I kind of worry I won't be able to keep everyone separate in my head. But every time I reach a point just a few pages in where everything just clicks and people's characterizations are so well drawn that you can tell them apart so easily after that point. So don't let that intimidate you too much, and if you do get a little confused at the beginning, I think that's pretty normal, and at least for me, that always goes away very quickly. So in addition to his somewhat revolutionary portrayal of women, Oscar Wilde also had a lot to say about the wealthy and upper classes. He was a big fan of criticizing the people who had more money than they knew what to do with and who looked down on the poorer or working class people. Even in The Importance of Being Earnest, which as I said is kind of his lighter and fluffier play, he's so biting when it comes to the upper classes, like the upper crust of society. Throughout all of Oscar Wilde's works, he makes it very clear that he does not admire people just for being nobility or just for being wealthy, which again, for that time and especially that place of the world, that was pretty groundbreaking. Or even if people had done it before him, for him to do it so blatantly and ludicrously, for him to make jokes out of wealthy people, that was a pretty revolutionary act. And finally, one of the other things that is common to all of Oscar Wilde's plays I've read that I really love is something I referred to earlier. He's so good at human nature and at recognizing the best and worst of people. Even though it might not look like it on the outside, some of his characters are pretty awful villains because they're awful in very ordinary, everyday ways. They're the kind of people who can ruin a young woman's life and not think anything of it, and their life is exactly the same afterwards. It's like that very kind of everyday evil that I think he was really good at communicating and showing. But conversely, he was also brilliant at showing some of the brightest spots in human nature. The self-sacrificing love a mother has for her children, or the intense bond between two friends, or the amazing capacity for kindness and forgiveness that are in everyday people. These are all things that he shows, and I think that's one of the reasons I love reading his plays so much, is because he unites all of these very different elements so seamlessly. He has good and evil, he has intense social commentary, he has lots and lots of humor, fantastic dialogue and characters. He has all of these things that make it a good story while also making it a meaningful story. I'm also going to briefly mention some recommendations as to which play to start with or which one to pick up of the ones that I have already read. And of course, these are just suggestions. Take it or leave it. If a different one calls to you, then obviously pick that one up. Importance of Being Earnest is a great one to start with if you want something a little bit lighter and maybe, like I said, you're just the slightest bit intimidated about picking up a playwright from the 1800s. Maybe you just want to dip your toe in and see how you feel about Oscar Wilde, so I think that one is a great one to start with. Lady Windermere's Fan is great if you want some of that humor, but you also want a deeper message or a deeper plot. As I said, that one is my personal favorite, and I think that it's extremely representative of his work as a whole because it's got all those funny moments and it's got that brilliant writing and characters, but it also has some moments that really pull on your heartstrings in a way that doesn't feel manipulative. It just feels very true to life. Salome is very different from all of his other works. It's a biblical story and it's got some really beautiful passages that almost read like poetry. I can't remember if they were written in prose or verse, but he's got some really different things he does in that play. So if you're not familiar with Oscar Wilde's works, I would maybe not start with that one, but I do think it's worth reading. And like I said, it's very fascinating to read something so different from the rest of his body of work. And finally, A Woman of No Importance is the most recent play I've read of his, and I also love that one. It's sort of similar to Lady Windermere's Fan in the balance between humor and sort of deeper issues. I'll talk more about it when I do my wrap-up for the Irish Readathon, but I do highly recommend that play as well. I will also link my video down below where I talked briefly about some tips and tricks for reading classic novels or plays or just books that you're intimidated about picking up. Because like I said, I definitely understand that it feels a little scarier to pick up something written in a completely different style, especially if you don't read a lot of plays. So I will link that video down below in case you're interested. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little feature on one of my favorite writers. I hope it inspired you to pick up some of Oscar Wilde's works, or maybe you're already a fan of his and this will reignite your desire to reread something from him. Let me know in the comments if you have read any of Oscar Wilde's works before, or if maybe you're going to start. I hope that if you are participating in the Irish Readathon that it is going well for you. I will see you guys soon with another video, and I hope you love the next book you read. Bye!